Well, we've made it. The end of 2024. 14 total cards, 19 title fights, and at least a half dozen late replacements giving me a non-insignificant amount of headaches. But all that being said, and despite my whinging, 2024 has been a really good year for UFC cards. The highs were wicked. Amazing KOs, title fight upsets, and the landmark UFC 300, all giving this year as a whole a pinpoint in UFC and I think even MMA history if you want to be honest. But as good as it sounds, and as good as I'm selling it as, the lows were pretty bad. We had duds of cards, boring events, and questionable judging decisions, although that one's a bit of a universal thing that's going to keep happening year after year, not that I'm going to stop harping on it. So, in sort of a celebration of the year and the fact that I did an episode for almost every card this year, we're going to take a look back in this shameless ripoff of an actual award show. We're using the categories of the best card, the worst card, the ref scorecard, my favorite KO, favorite fighter who pissed me off most this year, and it won't be a surprise, the best performance by a fighter, the best main event, the worst main event, and finally, my favorite fight of the year. Look, I'm trying to end it on a high note, that's why that one's there. With all that said, we're going to go to our first category, the best card. We're starting off with a pretty big award here, and there are a number of contenders for this title. Overall, it was a pretty good year. We had a lot of fun undercard fights, a lot of fun main events, but I really do feel that in the end, it has to go to UFC 300. I guess it's a little basic, but despite how many good cards happened this year, as soon as I thought about doing these awards, I immediately had to come back to UFC 300. From top to bottom, this card was loaded and delivered on promises. Deiveson Figueiredo opens the show against Cody Garbrandt and set a hell of a tone. It was the first of 8 finishes on this card and really showed the depth of technique and just straight up power. Doing a quick skim through this again, we had Lopez versus Youssef, Prochazka versus Rajic, the domination of Sterling Qatar, and that's all before the instantly iconic Holloway Gaethje, which was literally the MMA Awards Fight of the Year. The title fights were great too. Zhang Weili put on a clinic, cementing herself as one of the most successful champions at the 115 weight class and keeping it exciting for 5 rounds in a row. And then Alex Pereira puts Jamal Hill out 3 minutes and 14 seconds into the first round and starting his run with the light heavyweight belt. I mean, when the bad fights on your card are a Landa Slaughter fight in Harrison Holm and the absolute domination of Sterling over Qatar, I'm really hard-pressed to name a fight that looked this good on paper and basically delivered on every promise it brought forward. In the end, UFC 300 has to be my best card of the year. But for every amazing thing we gotta have a bad one. And we gotta talk about the worst card of the year. And if I'm being honest, this award was a little difficult for me to pick. I feel that there were plenty of cards that were disappointing or made themselves a slog to watch. And the winner, UFC 299, does fall into that category. Starting with the good, we have a few fights. Gamrot Dos Anjos, Yan Yadong, Burns Madalena, Poirier St. Denis, and admittedly, I'm a sucker for Curtis Blades. But 5 bright spots don't lift the card up enough in my opinion to get past the others this year and avoid this award. The undercard fights I'd mentioned had the bright spots here, but burying those was a slog to get through with the slow-paced action or major control-focused games, which I can respect but don't always enjoy watching, especially when it's very one-sided, like a chunk of these were. Even the main event wasn't great, or at least didn't reach its potential, with Vera getting outstruck 89 to 232 and thoroughly being dominated. Couple that with a number of early card fights that were a little low on action or played out as one could expect through and through. As I said, the highs of this card were there, and I really enjoyed them, but so much alpha of this card had me drinking Monster to keep some energy in my body to make it through the night. And when a fight card becomes a chore to make it through and stops being enjoyable, it really does become the worst card of the year for me. The ref scorecard. As mentioned earlier, there were 19 total title fights this year of varying quality. And with that comes the need for someone to lay down the law and try to keep things from getting too far out of control. Emphasis on try. And so we have the ref scorecard, or rather a tally. But either way, let's see how the big assignments were doled out this year. Tied for 4th place, we have Mike Beltran, Mark Smith, Jaron Villel, all of them having 1 title fight this year. Alone at 3rd place, Keith Peterson, who was handed 2 title fights this year. 2-way tie for 2nd, we have 2 recognizable names here. Jason Herzog and Herb Deem, both having officiated 4 separate title fights in the UFC this year. And the winner, with most title fights, in 1st place, Mark Goddard, who alone accounted for 6 title fights this year. Basically a full third of all title fights this year, and slightly less than half of the main events this same year. And I think he did a bang-up job. It was a great year for main events, very few of them being duds, and I can't think of many terrible reffing situations that happened in the main event this year. So keeping your name out of the books aside from availability, congratulations Mark Goddard. you had the most this year. Favorite KO. This category was a little odd to try and pick out, but in the end, it came down to 3 options for me. One was Miller Jackson at UFC 309 for the nasty guillotine. I am a sucker for guillotines. I'm a sucker for how he sunk that in. And I'm a sucker for how it looks so brutal. Gaethje Holloway puts their name out there because the entire fight leading to that moment, the point at the middle, and the deciding of 2 fighters to prove they were the baddest motherfucker in the octagon. And Magomedov Petrosian for the absurdity of a double spinning back fist, a move that's probably been pulled, but I certainly hadn't seen before. And after deliberation with myself, I decided to go with Magomedov Petrosian. I can't call it the most impactful KO in terms of a story in the UFC, or even establishing a rankings, but you have to admit, it was so smooth and something I can't remember ever seeing before. It's the audacity to throw a spinning back fist in general, have it not work, pause only a beat, immediately throw another one, catching them off guard and ending the fight in an instant. It's a slick KO you have to acknowledge, and in my opinion, it's the KO that's really going to stick with me going into next year. Now, favorite fighter. Now, admittedly, I did consider doing a best fighter category, but I couldn't be asked to actually do the research for that and determine who had the best year, who won the most fights, who had the best stats, so we're doing a favorite fighter instead, letting me be a lot more biased, not that I'm not already. In the end, I did have a few options. Some early adopters, some latecomers to the thing. Alexander Pantoja, Dricus du Plessis, Tom Aspinall, Curtis Blades, who's always kind of on this list for me, and even Oban Elliott did crawl his way onto this list by the end of the year. But in the end, my favorite fighter of the year is Diego Lopes. Firstly, he fought 3 times this year, UFC 300, 303, and 306. Each time he brought the action, either giving you a finish or bringing this action-packed fight you didn't expect, getting you back into the card. And with his 3 wins, I think he's thrown his name into the challenger picture and is posed for an interesting 2025. After that high note, we move on to the fighter that pissed me off the most this year. This was a short category to do and honestly just existed because I was really disappointed with how a few fighters' trajectories went this year. Chief on the list were Rebelis de Spain. He came in red hot, but quickly found out he couldn't wrestle, and that really put him a step behind a lot of heavyweights in that division and ended up with him getting released this same year. Anthony Smith also makes this list. He took an early win in 2024, but couldn't get the traction, ended 2024 with 2 straight losses. And the winner, by a not narrow margin, Kron Gracie. Look, this obviously is a personal award, so I am fully embracing the recency bias of this, and that is exactly why he wins it. I haven't been in on Kron Gracie since he decided to have a striking match with Cub Swanson and couldn't land a takedown against Charles Jourdain. But those both weren't in 2024, so why do they matter? You see, it matters for me because when, for some godforsaken reason, the fighter on a 2-fight losing streak with 1 UFC win gets placed on the main card of a fairly loaded UFC 310, aside from its main event, of course. That's over Sterling Evelev and Luque Garimbo. Honestly, I would have even taken Ray Smith over that fight being on the main card. So for the crime of being given a spot on the main card of UFC 310 when he should not have, Kron Gracie inherits the fighter that pissed me off the most this year award. Wear it with pride and prove me wrong somehow. Back to the high notes. We get the best performance by a fighter. I have to say, this category exists because I basically wanted to talk about this one specific moment. Because I got to see this play out on air while on vacation. We're talking about Dan Ige taking a short notice fight against Diego Lopes. Now, let me paint a scene for you. Lopes at this point had already had Brian Ortega miss weight and force the fight to catch weight, but then moving into the prelims, the alert flashes on the screen. Ortega's forced to drop out. Too sick to continue. But that's when it happens. Literally maybe 40-something minutes later, we get breaking news again. This time it's the video of Dan Ige coming to the Reno. It's the very definition of a last-minute fight. In comes Dan Ige. Called in, offered the fight while in the middle of the camp for a different fight 2 months out. And sure, he could have shown up and just lost, but this guy came willing to dance and put on a hell of a fight. And while Lopes had the clear edge, Ige made him work, and it never felt like he was dead in the water. We were watching this fight entranced. Maybe not even the right word, entranced, but we were enthralled by what was happening on the screen. The story, the moment, the fight that actually happened. It was all something that sticks out. I really don't think I can name a better performance this year under those circumstances. There were short notice fighters, but none quite like Dan Ige coming in 2 months out from his original fight, down to throw with a contender. Just an awesome moment, and one I think deserves it, hopefully gets its place in the UFC Hall of Fame, and gets people to give Dan Ige some more flowers. Riding the high notes, the best main event. This is a category that gave me quite a few problems, if I'm being honest, because while it would have been really easy to pick a Pereira KO or a Pantoja fight right off the top of my head, I really wanted to think back to the full year and actually try to be fair, which is rare for me, and not just pick the UFC 300 event or the most recent one. So that brings me to my choice. Really coming down to between UFC 308's Topuria Holloway or UFC 305's Du Plessis Adesanya. And I have to give it to Du Plessis Adesanya. Everything leading up to this fight was wild, because the opinion of each fighter was so wild. Adesanya was still a boogeyman lurking around the division and was still given great odds to get the belt back. I mean, Vegas had it even at the time. But Du Plessis was this enigma. He would look like he was struggling, like he was gassed on one foot out the door, but would just win. It was such a confusing matchup to look at. A fighter who had the better striking, a better cardio, and the fighter who just won. It was this matchup where either fighter had every possibility to win. Adesanya could take control, dictate pace with his range, or Du Plessis could keep the pressure up and force Adesanya on the back foot and maybe even finish him, which he did. And the fight itself delivered. 4 rounds of decent action that neither fighter ever fell out of. And the constant looming threat of finish both fighters presented kept you glued to the screen. But it's been too happy for too long. On to the worst main event. For the worst main event, do I really need to say more? It's UFC 310. The card itself turned into a pleasant surprise, but we're not talking about the card. This is in terms of the main event only. There was no weight to the matchup. And trying to argue legacy is a cop-out. Stipe was 42 years old, 5 years older than Jones, coming off a KO loss 3 years before to a guy who is no longer in the UFC, is off making money boxing and fighting in the PFL. He is one of the greatest UFC heavyweight champions, sure, but he's not fighting anywhere close to that level anymore. The last time we saw him, his soul got knocked out of his body by a Francis Ngannou who learned takedown defense. So there's no weight to the mashup. What were the stakes? And there's the other problem here. Maybe they could have gotten away with running on pure hype, but there wasn't even that for this. Anyone I talked to was beyond uninterested, and the few people I cajoled into watching it seemed like they were bored when the main event rolled around. So with no weight, no stakes, and no hype, it's the perfect example of a lame duck event that only escaped the worst card category because I fondly remember a lot of that undercard. And for the last bit of the show, my favorite fight of the year. This was hard, not only because I had to crawl back through my notes and my memories to actually dig one out, but because there were a lot of really good fights this year. I'm not talking just main events. I'm not talking prelims. I'm not talking early prelims. I'm talking all of them put together. But in the end, I'm giving my nod to Dustin the Diamond Poirier versus God of War Benoit Saint-Denis. And as odd as the choice as it seems, a big part of this reasoning is the story and everything behind it. So let me set a scene. Poirier's last fight going into this was in 2023 and was a KO loss to Justin Gaethje, where he never seemed to get traction. It felt like he was on his way out, and I'm pretty sure around this time we started hearing the retirement rumors, and that he might be winding down. Saint-Denis was almost the complete opposite. He fought 3 times in 2023 and won each fight by KO, steadily advancing the ranks with each opponent. Bonfim, Moises, Frivola all went down before that final bell and gave Saint-Denis the air of a new age monster, the up-and-comer. So we have the young up-and-comer versus the old guard with retirement rumors flowing around. This fight almost was billed as a passing of the torch. We're going to see if Denis can prove where he stands, can prove that he is the finishing monster versus the old guard who really is on his way out. And then the fight kicks off and Saint-Denis takes control. 53 total strikes to Poirier's 14, a dominant lead with an additional 2 takedowns landed, giving him 3 minutes and 20 seconds of control time. Dominant first round for the newcomer, and Poirier's already in the hole fighting from behind. Only a 3-round fight. Second round starts, and it just feels like a second verse. Saint-Denis taking control and pushing a lot of the action. Poirier does manage to keep him down to 1 successful takedown and a minute 33 of ground control, but he's fighting from behind. Then he rocks him. Denis on the back foot. Denis shoots a takedown and Poirier tries his guillotine. Can't sink it. Though he forces another scramble and both get back to the feet. And then it lands. Poirier ends in an instant, flatlining the up-and-comer and proving he's still here. Poirier went on to get a title fight that he did lose against Islam Makhachev, which isn't part of this. But that whole story was something that brought me in. The whole story leading into it of the up-and-comer, passing of the torch, all that, and Poirier coming in, fighting from behind and proving that, hey, I'm not quite done yet. Was just a moment that led up into a really good fight on a card that I didn't love, but loved that moment of. That is why that is my fight of the year. But in the end, that's 2024. A pretty good year for the UFC, all things considered. Landmark UFC 300 obviously being the major highlight. And overall, a wonderful year for fighting fans. Octagon takes off. One is still doing its thing, although there's a number of controversies there I should probably get into. And looking forward, I hope to do more with this. I hope to look into more fights. I hope to bring new perspectives. And I hope to look at a lot of new up-and-coming fighters in a different light. I enjoyed 2024, and I look forward to 2025. And I hope you enjoyed watching this year, and I hope you join me on to bigger and better things next year. All that being said, Go ahead and leave your opinions, what you disliked and liked in the comments. Tell me what your best for each category was. And as always, have a great fight.